couple of miles long demudding pond. A pond that will actually settle all of the mineral matter that is unwanted in the salt, such as clay and sand. And then once a day, this is brought into the holding tank here. And as you can see, even the holding tank has the longest possible run of water, so that in the beginning of the day, when they allow this to be open, it leaves just enough water for the day's harvest. And it goes again in a spiralic direction through a whole series of ponds that are desiccating and drying up the salt. When through a lot of meanders, it gets through to a point here where the magnesium salts become actually higher in their density and concentration than the salt. The excess magnesium, and we'll talk about what the excess can do, is allowed to return to the ocean through this particular inlet here. The water will continue concentrating more and more into its salt, and instead of 330 grams per liter, we have almost 200 grams per liter when we get to this point here. And by the time the water is allowed in the last crystallizer here, in the last evaporator, the operator will then lift up the valve here and allow each carnation, because that is what each square is called, each carnation to evaporate enough water to create a fairly large mound of salt at the end of the day's harvest. This is repeated every day for 3 months during the hottest part of the year. We also have a different kind of salt that we're going to talk about, and that will show you how it's harvested. Okay. Teba, lie down, right there. Come on. Teba, come. Because she's going to move just about at that time. Lie down right here and stay. Good girl. Lie down. Good. Stay.
5, 4, 3.
We've had a long time love affair with a substance that covers 4/5 of the earth. And although we have been told many times that salt is not very good for us, there is a definite love affair between us and salt.
Can we start again?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's quite all right.
I wasn't sitting right.
Mm-hmm.
I'll wait for this car to pass.
Mm-hmm. Good girl, Teba. Stay.
Okay.
We've had a love affair with a substance that is so overpowering and so tremendously important for the quality of our life. And this love story has gone on for millions of years. And it really comes from a substance that is so prevalent, so widespread on this earth, that we cannot go anywhere without finding it. And if you can see, 4/5 of our globe is covered with wonderful seawater. How we get the salt is a very important factor, because even though primitive man relied on just twigs that he could pick up along the seashore, and lo and behold, he could see that the crystallization yielded some wonderful cubic crystal that could be used for making food taste and digest better. The method of harvesting salt is of utmost importance, because the mineral profile and the composition of salt makes a big difference in the way we will feel and even in the way we will think. So one of the methods that has been in existence for at least 900 years that we know of is the Celtic method for harvesting salt. Here we have a very fine watercolor rendering showing that far off at the horizon, the ocean with all of its turmoil and all of the big waves is actually creating new salt all the time. Large, wide channels of at least a mile wide are bringing that seawater inland to a series of salt marshes. The water is allowed in many of these narrow channels and continues to meander through the countryside near the seashore. And at places along that channel, the water is allowed in through a weir to come into a pond that demuds the water. It takes out the sand, the clay, any suspense particle that are not salt, and the water here in the demudding pond becomes crystal clear. It is then allowed through a small inlet here into a further clearing pond, and then once a day enough water is allowed under the dike here so that it goes into the turn around the installation itself and the crystallizing system. There are several of these in about 8,000 acres in Brittany. The very first coming out of the turn of the water, or the turn of the mud, the flat, allows the water to desiccate and to concentrate the salt brine from 30 grams per liter or per quart to about 300 grams per liter. As we continue our meandering here, we come to a very important point, and that is the point where the bittern, the very bitter part of seawater, is allowed to leave the brine and return through this weir here to the ocean every day. Stripped of much of its magnesium, the saline solution will continue through these ponds and will continue to concentrate in a spiral motion following a very, very shallow system of ponds up to the point where it comes to the last evaporator and begins to be allowed here once a day in the carnation. This is what we call the 30 by 17 foot crystallizers. And it is here that by a series of hand manipulation, the salt maker will create the wet and moist crystals of salt that we are so aware exists. Throughout the world, we have, of course, many different kinds of salt. This is from Poland, a salt that is made in a salt mine. This is a salt from Hawaii that has a very reddish color because the Hawaiian natives insist on mixing alae dirt with it. It has pretty much the same taste, but it lacks the moisture that we need to have in our salt. The Chinese have again salt, which they also make from earth salt or from an underground spring salt. But again, all of these salts are lacking the presence of the ocean. We still have an interesting combination where crystals are made here on a twig, and yet, even though this is a very primitive salt, it seemed to be a very natural salt. It really contains too much magnesium. So the real art in making salt for human is to, with a certain amount of manual labor, to make sure that the salt is very similar to our body fluids. And this is what we are going to see in our table of minerals, and how by harvesting method and by different ways of harvesting, we can create a salt that is absolutely, shall we say, earmarked for humans. So let's proceed to the very next kind of salt that we make, and that would be the flour of ocean. The flour of ocean is not harvested with a long rake, but with a very short one, and because it crystallizes in surface, it has to be picked up from the floating surface of the pond and drained into a basket. At that point, the salt still contains about 9% moisture. The moisture is very important because if we drive out the moisture, we also drive out a fairly large amount of the minerals that are so essential in salt. So we can establish the first rule, and that is a dry salt is a less than human salt. If you begin to dry salt, you begin to lose a certain amount of the very essential minerals that are very important for our biochemistry. I think maybe we can cut there. I think that's as...
Okay.
Why?
Delicate.
Here we go.
Can you also pick up the red one? And I want to get a close-up of that. I missed it. And the calisol bag. I wanted to get a close-up too. Show me your hand. Okay. And can you pick up that white bag, the big calisol bag?
Oh, this is Polish salt.
Okay.
Okay.
And whatever else you want, close-ups of. I'll tell you when.
For a long time now, we've had a love affair on this earth. And the love affair is with one particular substance that has been on this earth from the time of its creation. Seawater covers almost 4/5 of the Earth's surface. It yields a very complex substance that is sea salt. And even though we have been warned against sea salt by the recent predictions of the medical profession, we still have a continuing love-hate affair that goes on with salt and with humans. From the time of birth, from the time before birth, we are so completely surrounded with a saline solution that we can hardly do without. Primitive man understood this very well. And so the first way that one could extract salt from the ocean was by allowing the salt to crystallize on branches and twigs such as these. The taste, however, of each crystal, each cubic crystal of salt was so delightful, would wake up the taste buds so much, make food so much more tasty and appealing, and also much more digestible, that we never stopped our love for salt. Salt can come in many forms. This is, for instance, salt from the desert, from the Sahara Desert. It is carried for thousands of miles still on camel's back and is exchanged on the salt market, ounce for ounce, 1 ounce of gold for 1 ounce of salt. That is the price of salt in some of the areas where salt starvation could be a problem. In China, however, and this is Chinese salt, there's never any problem with salt because it comes from the earth through bamboo pipes, and it really has a very bitter taste. We can say the same thing about mine salt from Poland. This mine salt is totally dehydrated, has an entirely different profile, is very healing for the lungs, but as a food salt, it lacks certain very vital and essential elements. The salt in Hawaii comes in a red form and is very delicious for the natives. And yet, because it is mixed in with red earth in order to give it some substance and some minerals, it is also, in the way of many people, in the opinion of many people, quite deficient. We have many other forms of salt. This is a totally refined salt from China, which is beginning to show in China that it is creating problems health-wise as well as mineral and demineralization. So we've come to the conclusion that the method that is used for harvesting salt makes the biggest difference in the final quality of salt. And here we are going to study how Brittany Celtic salt is being harvested during the 3 hot months of summer. And the method used yield a salt that is perfect for our biology and in perfect balance with the requirement of the human chemical. Far out at the horizon is the brooding North Sea, or sometimes we call it the Celtic Sea. But it is forever creating juvenile salt by a constant movement of its very deep trenches of the ocean. The upwelling that brings up extra minerals from the very depth of ocean will actually come and be channeled inland to the several hundreds of installations that are lining the very calm and very pristine coastline of Brittany. Channels such as these will bring in the water and allow a very long course, and the longer the course and the more evaporation you will create. And from space to space along this line, openings and weirs allow the water to come into very large demudding ponds. This demudding pond is a couple of miles long and allows the water to become crystal clear by dropping and actually concentrating all of the mud and the salt and the sand at the bottom of the demudding pond. There is an extra smaller weir here that is open once a week and that allows the very clear brine to come through and be further cleared. Then the tour of the installation is a very narrow channel, no more than a foot wide, that allows the water to become more and more concentrated. We start with 30 grams of water per quart, and we end up at about 150 grams, 5 times that amount. And by the time we reach this point here, we are actually higher in bittern than we are in sodium chloride. In other words, a very bitter salt, full of magnesium, sometimes even more than sodium chloride. And we have to get rid of that excess amount of magnesium through this bittern outlet that returns the excessive bitter water back to the ocean and back out at sea. The sodium chloride, with all 92 different trace minerals, continues on its way, and as you can see, there is an extreme amount of very extended surface that in a spiral motion allows the water to further concentrate up to the point where it turns from the blue color to this beautiful reddish color, and this is our final concentrating pond, the two of them here, that then allow the water to come into the very first carnation, where the water is then allowed to go in the crystallizers themselves, long and narrow, 17 feet wide, that will create, by the work of man, by the eddying that the man creates with a special wooden tool, that eddying will actually make the crystal appear in as little as 2 or 3 hours. This is harvested daily for the 3 months between July, August, and September. And with a wooden wheelbarrow, it will be brought back to the very large treme, or the stock of salt that once a week is taken away and put in storage, away from the rain that could occur even during the summer. There is also another method of harvesting which yields actually a salt that is much tinier in crystal. And we're talking about the flower of ocean. The flower of ocean is harvested from the surface of the pond, is not raked but picked up by a very fine surface tools, and the salt is then dropped into this basket and is allowed to drain overnight. In the morning, that salt is put away. It is a very pricey salt. They call it the caviar of salt, but it has, because of its exposure to the energy of heaven, it has a tremendous calming influence. And that is why many people call it the feminine salt. The feminine essence is really addressed by this salt. Whoops. This is an aerial view of the salt flats. It shows the channel. It also shows a very large demudding pond in the front here. And it shows an inlet into a slightly different shape, different from our watercolor, but it shows also a multitude of carnation where each little mound of salt is already filled. This is taken at midday. And we see in the foreground here the very large stack of salt, which is again taken away once a week. The demudding pond in the rear, you can see how it has just been filled. This one also, and we show at the far horizon here extra of the 9,000 acres of salt flats, a production that may not be sufficient at this time to feed the world. And so we are very fortunate to have access to one of the finest salt that is made in the world. How's that?
Great.
Are we okay?
Can you stand back where you were and just pick that picture up again the right way so we can cut out of that?
Yeah, okay. And here we have an aerial view of the salt flat showing a very large installation with many carnations and a very, very busy salt maker, because we have many ridges, many of these pads that are completely filled with salt.
Great. Can you pick up the Chinese salt? Let me get a close-up of that.
Mm-hmm.
The red bag. I messed up right there.
This one?
The red bag, it's got red writing on the front.
Oh.
Yeah, let me just get a close-up of that with in your hand. Hold on. Kind of fondle it. Whoop. Great.
Okay.
What else? There was one other little thing.
You want more twigs?
No, twigs are good.
You have enough? Okay.
On a d'autres boîtes comme ça, oui, hein, pour les... Il y aura trois différentiels comme ça, hein,
Oui.
un prix spécial.
Je sais pas encore.
Pas encore, c'est-à-dire il y a la boîte ou s'il y a payé.
Hein?
Il faut pas payer la boîte.
Ah oui, il faut payer la boîte.
Ah oui.
Oui, il faut payer la boîte. Ok.
Ah, tu fais voir tous les échantillons comme ça.
Ah oui, autant, hein, je vais pas tout montrer à la fois.
C'est une bonne idée. Une excellente idée.
Voilà.
Bien.
Comme ça, on est en bon état. If we can get close enough to really get the difference of texture between... Okay.
Open that box and just tilt it towards me.
Do you want permanent tilt in there? I'll put this rock under.
Great.
Is that good?
Great.
I like the squeaky sound of sound of that wood box as it opens. So,
Can you work it so that you can stand? Well, yeah.
which way?
That'd be better because
Here?
the light was just a little.
Uh-huh, okay.
Okay.
So if we look at, and we should really look at the three different ways that salt is presented. We have in our little homemade box, which is called a salt cellar, sometimes it's even called a salt box. We have the beautiful large crystals of the light gray. We have the flower of ocean. And then we have the fine ground, which is the light gray that has been dried to the point of about 0.5% of moisture, and then has been ground on stones, on natural stone, in order to achieve this wonderful texture that you can use in desserts, on salad dressing, and in pastries, and so forth. The original light gray salt always retains moisture, and you know very well that if you pick up this salt, the very fact that it has retained moisture, so much moisture that it actually to the point of clinging to the finger, that is really your sign that this is a totally natural, undried salt. And that is the way salt should be. It should have a clinging quality, because pickler, for instance, people who make prosciutto, ham, or pickled of any sort, pickled cucumbers and so forth, to take the bitterness away, this salt is very important. And as a fruit salt, as a salt with all of its, shall we say, natural element totally preserved, all 92 elements of the earth, this is the salt that it should be the preference for everyone. The salt also can be put into a nice ceramic dish. This is, again, a salt cellar. It has a little flower of the ocean in it. And this is what is used in our kitchen, and my wife uses the flower of ocean. It says gros sel because this is really the salt that is of choice for French people to use for gourmet salt, but for gourmet salt, this is really the flower of ocean. And so we have a tour of horizon that shows us exactly how important it is to have salt in its natural form. And so make friends with salt, because salt can be your best insurance for perfect harmony with nature. Thank you. And now, after making a full tour of horizon and looking at the forms of salt, we just have to remember that it is important to choose salt in its most natural form, with still the moisture of the ocean present in it. And so I just want to make sure that you understand it is important to make friends with salt, because in the final analysis, salt is really your best insurance for maintaining the best possible condition in your body at all time. Salt is part of nature and belongs in everyday food. There's a big motor going on. Maybe we should wait a minute or so. Yeah, it's getting stronger. He's probably coming this way. Let me go and have a quick. There's wind, there's wind. Wait a second. And I also have a better idea. And so we've made a complete tour of the horizon of salt. We've looked at the different kinds of salt. But most important to remember is that salt must be in its most natural form. And to ensure that, of course, the method of harvesting is by far the most important influence on the final quality of salt. So if I can ask you to make friends with salt, because your body is saline, and in order to remain in harmony with nature, you need that saline solution within. And so I bid you good day.
Okay, do you want to do it again?
Yeah.
That was good.
And so we have.
Oh, hold on.
And now we have come full term on our tour of horizon of salt. We've looked.
You want to start again?
Start again?
Yeah.
Okay.
That was a little jittery.
Yeah. And so we have made a full tour of horizon of the salt. We've looked at different kinds of salt. But we have to remember that in order to have the most natural form of salt, the method of harvesting is by far the crucial point. So I want to ask you to make friends with salt, because salt is your best way of remaining in harmony with nature, because your body is saline and salt is truly the friend of mankind. And so with that thought, I can leave you and bid you good day.
Great. Do you want to do
That last one is just fine.
Okay.
I feel good with it.
Actually,
Yeah. No?
I did one jittery.
Okay, do it again.
zoom in.
Do it again. That's okay.
I'm sorry. I started and stopped kind of thing. I'd like to get a little looser shot.
Looser? Okay.
Okay, hold on. Smile at the people. That'll come across nicely.
And so here we are at the end of our tour of horizon of the whole salt question. We've looked at different kinds of salt. But let's remember that the most natural form of salt very closely depends on the method of harvesting. And so if you remember that your body is saline, that it requires to be constantly surrounded with salt, it is important for you to make friends with salt in order to remain in harmony with nature. And with that thought, I bid you good day.
Oh, should we wait for the wind?
little
Whenever
bird.
you find that it's quiet,
It
begin.
sounds good now. Ah, car coming. I don't know if you hear that with this close a microphone. It does.
I'll be
It does
curious.
pick it up. I think we can go. And so we've completed our tour of horizon of the salt question with the very different kinds of salt that we looked at. The one thing to remember is that salt in its most natural form depends very strongly on the method of harvesting that is used. So because our body is saline, in order to be in complete harmony with nature and to make friends with nature, it is important to also make friends with salt. And with that thought, I leave you and bid you good day.